If you don't know me, I'm Megan Gordon. I'm the director of OCHI. I'm so happy to invite you all here today. It just feels really good to gather with people in Los Angeles around art in art spaces with artists and all of us who support artists. In the last few weeks, obviously, it's been really hard, but I feel optimistic and motivated every time we all get together. And I'm delighted to be able to present this beautiful conversation with a couple of old friends who have worked together many times before. Michael Slenske, who you may know as a writer, editor, curator, kind of Renaissance man, and now is officially the director of the Untitled Houston Art Fair that's going to debut later this year. Super exciting. And of course, Emily Marchand. This is Emily's first show of OCHI. It's so special. Delighted to have you guys here in conversation, and that's all I need to say. Thank you all for coming. And if you have questions afterwards, you can come find me. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Hey, all.
Hi.
Very Texas now. So, yeah, I think this is a good kind of space to be gathering. And I think this show is interesting. Hey. Because, Emily and I are talking about this and we've worked together in the past. And I think a lot of her work has to do with life cycles. And sort of things that grow, things that mature, things that die, and what comes after. And I think we're in that moment right now, sort of like, societally, politically, with these fires that are happening. But I think this show, let's just start it where it starts. I love this title, The Slumber of a Prince. Talk to us about how that starts, and then we can kind of get into the meatier stuff.
Okay. Hi, everyone. The show title came up when our dog passed away last August, and I had been working on this body of work about him for his whole life when he would be sleeping. That's the not meaty stuff. His whole life when he would be sleeping, we would always walk in and say, "The slumber of a prince." And so this show...
She promised she wouldn't cry.
Anyone in here who knows me knows better than that. And so that seemed like the most appropriate title for this show.
And so this show is interesting because what's happening here is this is not like a posthumous picture. This is sort of a celebration of life rather than a remembrance. It's sort of capturing the essence of this creature, but in a bigger way that relates to all these things that, Emily's work often talks about food ecology and food scarcity. And, you talk about this idea of survival ideology and some of in agriculture. And again, these life cycles. How does this dog fit into that framework?
Well, I feel like when this show started to get organized, at the very beginning, I had a meeting with Megan in my studio, and she saw 3 of the OCHI sculptures and had very generously asked me what a show would look like around these 3 sculptures. And at that point, OCHI was still alive, but in his winter years. And I was really wanting to make a nighttime dreamscape show that was very loose and, ethereal, and allowed myself to kind of work with imagery that is familiar to me, but also not necessarily have it fit into the structures that I usually work with. When I was in grad school, I was really focused on seed banks and vaults and food scarcity and accessibility. The survivalist stuff came into prepper ideology, which is really fascinating to me. But as we've changed politically over the last few years, I got very nervous around that ideology because I found within that language was a lot of very anti-immigrant conversations in a very like, this is our land. And so I wear my politics on my sleeve, and I got really afraid to kind of get too immersed in it. And I also think I learned, I don't know if it's a grad school thing where you're just like, this is about this, and I'm teaching you about that. And it kind of changed where once we were so saturated politically, I started really understanding that whether I'm studying it and you're not, we're all feeling it in so many ways, and everyone doesn't need it, beaten into them. And so the work during pandemic times kind of relaxed, for lack of a better word, into still being about food accessibility and growing food, but also starting to wrap itself around things that I love also. So.
Well, and then there's this sort of, like it's almost like in this show you have this sort of Monet meets Manet. You have this like Arcimboldo capture of a dog, but then you also have like the dog portraits of like, Koons or Hockney or Manet and they're competing, and then it's sort of this like Giverny sort of situation, this dreamscape landscape. Was that, and I think those are almost like the palette kind of relaxed too. Can you talk about that and how because you said you've been developing because these are sort of more like, again, like that Arcimboldo thing. And then the other part is this sort of relaxed, looser, more ethereal palette and dreamy thing. I mean, how do you think those two things interact? Because they're like one's super tight and the other is like a little bit different, even though they were both sort of about, I would say, like dreams and the subconscious in a way.
Well, the 3 dogs, I say there's 4 dogs total, but the one in the back is the newest, and I think clearly kind of different than the rest. Also maybe one of the saddest things I've ever made. But the 3 dogs I made during pandemic when I got a new studio. And at that time, any show or any residency had disappeared, basically. And I found myself by myself in my studio, making work for myself, basically, without like a plan. And so I think in my mind, I'm always experimenting. Like the next thing is always like a new way of working with the material, or I'm just trying to constantly at least shift something a little bit for my own sake. And so I feel like I have a couple pieces before that are like more vessel-like, but then in the studio they shifted to the dogs. And I think with the dreamscape, I've gotten more comfortable painting and feeling like I like painting, but there's always these like dividing lines in our mediums. And I feel like I just started finding myself very unapologetically experimenting. And I think even giving myself the narrative of a dreamscape kind of allowed rules to fall away, even in the making of things, if that makes sense. Well,
and then like you come from this background of, two very, because you started in photography, right? And ceramics and photography share this sort of, very technical aspects of how you sort of start with that framework. And there's not that doesn't exist with painting, but it seems like you've, it's like know the rules to break them is how you're kind of approaching, and like that seems to be where this show is, like it's a part of what I call like an artist practice when all the moves collapse. And, you're sort of letting everything to, whether it's conscious or not, they all kind of, all these things that you've been doing sort of, overtly or, subconsciously, they all sort of like align. Do you think that sort of happened here, like in a way that maybe you didn't understand at first?
Yeah, I do. And I think like in my mind, I was like over making for the show because I like to edit. but in that came a lot of different ways of making. And I think I was just trying to like noodle out a lot of ways, you know, to get it done. Like in my mind, like this piece is a version of that piece. You know, it's like in my mind, things kind of ping pong or support each other in a way. And I just know that, you know, I'm not much of like a sketch planner, but I'm a list maker. And so
are you a Virgo or something?
I'm very much an Aries.
Oh. I think of lists.
Oh yeah, yeah. But I think I'm married to a Virgo. Are you a Virgo? Yeah, I think that I kind of mapped out the work of what like I wanted the ideas to be, and then even with the blue tones, all of the pieces are at least three different shades of blue that all kind of came together. Usually I'll like brush on glaze, and this I ended up using like a paint roller for the first time, because I just wanted it to kind of become one but still have its own parts, I guess. Mm-hmm. But with glazes, you know, it's so experimental that, you know, when you open the kiln, you just kind of hope and wish it's going to be what you want.
Well, and I think what's going on here too, which I think that the relationship of this work, you know, to that piece in the back, is this idea of collage. And that's sort of, I mean, you talk about this idea of like collage is where everything starts for you. Can you talk about that a little bit more? Like this, because that was like when you were like a teenager, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Do you mean like the Family of Man stuff? Yeah. I think like as a teenager.
How did you come to that? Like.
Yeah. As a teenager, I think I was always trying to make art, but I didn't really have any skills to do it. And it was really frustrating because you're like, feel like you're stuck inside trying to work it out. And I had some more darker times in that where I was just like, this is never gonna be what I want it to be. But I found when I was like 18-ish, I found a copy of The Family of Man at my grandma's house. It's an exhibition from MoMA in New York from 1955. Do you guys all know that? Yeah. And it's all broken down by people being people, whether it's lovers or parents or war, you know, it's all these different groups of versions of humanity. And I feel like that was a really inspiring spot for me to like go and start taking pictures of people that I would see out in the world, you know, barbers or people just being themselves. Yeah.
Is it kind of one of those, you know, I think that a show like, because that show's kind of divisive in a way, like like the reception of that show is, you know, people go back and forth of what they think it is and if it's sort of patronizing or something. But I think what you're talking about is the framing of it and this idea of like, you know, as a young artist or a young person trying to be an artist, I think there's this, this too is art, you know, like, wow, like I could, this is also what you could be as the, you know, the collage could be the show. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I didn't learn that show was divisive until later. And I was like, I think young enough when I learned that, but still surprised, you know, and then over time, I've been able to wrap around, you know, like documenting people is complicated, you know, and, you know, you can, especially like for art. I mean, we've seen people in LA going up to the fire zones and stuff. And it's just like, I think you have to be really conscious when you're engaging, you know, like even like street photography, it's like what level, if you go down to Skid Row, like that's like a really complicated thing to do if you don't have any sort of relationship to it or the people, you know what I mean? And so I've learned.
But not just the divisiveness, I'm saying like the framework of using a show as a collage. I think that's playing out here. So I think that's like this full circle moment in a way.
Yeah. I don't see that yet. But I'll think about it.
Right.
Yeah. But I see what you mean. I just have to kind of process that.
But like this piece is collaged.
Yeah.
That piece is collaged.
Yeah.
And you're breaking the work to kind of remake it.
Yeah.
And that I think is like you're loosening it up intentionally. Like you're kind of, you're creating problems for yourself.
Yes. When I broke that piece up, I was like, what am I doing? But I'm glad I did. I say the only way forward is through in my studio all the time, where it just is like, I feel like, especially in experimenting, it's like really easy to abandon an idea or a sculpture if it's not going your way. And when I was younger, I can't believe I'm telling you all this, but when I was younger, I was a competitive speed skater. And this is a secret, but I was pretty good at it, at a young age. And then after that, anything else I tried was like, I'm not very good at that. Like, put it aside. And there was a part, like, I feel like when I was about 20, that and maybe even later, where I started learning, like, everything is worth investing time in. That anything that you're really interested in is worth really investing time in. And so I feel like my work, time is a pretty big factor of just like even the length of time something takes to make one thing, or a practice of learning how to learn the rules and break the rules. I don't know if I've gone on a tangent, but yeah.
But this idea of like creating this complication of, breaking this piece to come back to it, to put it together, to, what was the impulse for that? I mean, because I think in certain practices, they'd want it to be so rendered and perfect. And I think that you're embracing, like, obviously with ceramics, there's this, chance, and you don't know what's going to happen because it's a, chemical process and about fire and what that does. But why do that to something like this, or even these pieces?
Yeah.
Like you're disarticulating everything.
Well, ceramics break. That is true. They'll break your heart in the process of breaking. But also, I just feel like the ideas around the show are actually emotionally heartbreaking, and I felt like while I would normally try to patch it up and tuck it away, I just kind of welcomed it. I actually feel like this show is the first time that I kind of think I'll welcome it forever, because ceramics do break. It's a part of the process, and even if it's broken, the artwork still exists.
Yeah.
And I feel like there's so much, and I feel like I can speak for plenty of friends that move on. I did the Long Beach residency in ceramics, and so many peers from all over were, if the piece came out broken, it was done. And we gratefully have a lot of art in our yard now. So I was like, I'll take that. But also, I like the work still exists to me. And I think that ceramics might get, in my mind, ceramics gets an extra pass in that camp because it's the nature of the material.
Yeah.
But that piece, I broke, I don't know, I broke more. I really worried about what I was doing when I was doing it. I didn't know if I'd be able to put it back together. And, at that point it was pretty much done, besides building the frame and doing the grout. But I don't know, I just felt like I took a risk on it. And I can't see that work as a whole unbroken piece. Like, it doesn't make sense to me now.
Yeah, I mean, there's this line in the press release for the show that I find interesting. And it kind of speaks to this. It's the Slumber of a Prince features ceramic sculptures, wallworks, and vessels that consider tenderness and care as strategies to access a range of emotions with a timely focus on joy and grief. And I don't know, I feel like you kind of you embody that by doing these things. Like you're creating the situation for the care and the tenderness, but also the joy and the grief.
Mm-hmm.
You know, like you're giving yourself a space for a hug or something.
Mm-hmm. My friend Estrella said it was like a warm blanket. And I think that was nice, especially with with the fires, that it was like a space for people to kind of come, in my opinion, like if you've ever loved anything, that like you could wrap yourself around this show, and this work. So like strategies is a hard thing for me to take on.
Mm-hmm.
Like I'll accept it as the writing of the press release, but like I don't think I think of it strategically.
Yeah.
I guess, I think it's like somewhere between emotional and material and, conceptual, like things coming together in a way that harness all of those feelings. And yeah.
Yeah, and it's also like a tricky road, like it's a serious thing, making works about animals, and there's a lot of serious artists that Goya made a great painting of a dog, and like the Warhol Maurice painting is like very beloved, but I think it can kind of like get into this like kitsch phase. But I think it's a weird relationship too, where unlike any other relationship, the idea is that you will outlive this thing. Like any other relationship, you want it to kind of like have like an infinity or something. And I think with animals, especially pets, that it's gonna. And so like what you were doing too is you were taking this thing that was finite, and then like how did you have the foresight to do this thing? They're using the word effigies as the gallery of like
Mm-hmm.
what you're making, but you're making this like totemic object before, and those are like loving things, like portraits, but
Mm-hmm.
kind of that there's like a timeline involved.
Yeah.
Like what was the point in which you started to do that?
To make.
Yeah, like to kind of, whatever. I mean, maybe you see a finish line or something, or.
No, never. Well, I really did start making these sculptures specifically of Ozzy during pandemic.
Mm-hmm.
And I had, I think I was saying it before, like wrapping the ideas that I was already working with and applying it to this creature that I love.
Mm-hmm.
And I think something happened for me there, even as a sculptor, where I made one and I had this fear that I wouldn't know how to make another one. Someone asked to buy it and I was like held onto it so tightly because I was like, people were like, just make another one. And I was like, I don't know how.
Yeah.
And I think that kind of goes into even the like experimenting department for me, where it's like one is made, but it's not like a factory in that sense, where it's like takes kind of a lot of like, I don't know. I make them pretty fast, but that like the idea that I can make more is kind of lost on me a little bit, even though there's now 4 versions.
Well, yeah, and they kind of feel like there's like a life cycle to these,
Yeah.
like the show that we did with these, it was dealing more with those seed vaults, and then like Emily's made these cigarette sculptures. They're extruded pieces that are sort of stamped out cigarettes, and like that whole show. And there was one dog and a fountain work in this sort of seed vault situation.
This is a fountain.
That was a fountain, right?
Yeah, this guy.
You have this sense of life cycle and like sort of abundance and scarcity in that show. But what is there like the seasons of Ozzy with these?
Yeah, I honestly hadn't thought about it in that way, but I think it's in there somewhere, I guess. Especially the winter one in the back.
Yeah.
But yeah, I do think a lot about, with talking about the food, relationship to food. And we did a show together that was based on the 4 seasons. And the idea is that in each season, there are kind of stereotypes of each season, where you have like summer with tomatoes and peaches and heat, and fall is grapes, and harvest, etc. And when we did the show together, I was really interested in how, as we look at the news every day and we watch our city burn, what we once called summer or fall or spring, we call fire season, or flooding season, and how collectively our language around these seasons that used to be, or maybe even still do, used to tell time and keep track of our food, is now shifting into this idea that's very disaster based. And so for me, these get to live mostly within the original celebration of a season, but also the animals almost always have like a tear coming out of their eye. And there's little nods to that, because that goes back to what I was saying about trying not to beat everyone over the head with what we're all fearing and feeling. Like there's somewhere, for me, like the celebration and joy of the things that I love, I'm trying to contain, while they all too fall under that umbrella of all of the big shit that we're overwhelmed by all the time. It's nothing is separate. And so as far as like kitschiness or that kind of stuff, for me,
I'm not saying these are kitschy.
No,
I'm saying, like, in a sense,
I
like
think
a
about
dog
that.
portrait could be.
I think about that because they're very cute, and they're fun and funny and adorable in a lot of ways. But also, like, for me, like, they hold a gravity that is kind of hard for me to live. This show was originally going to be in Idaho, and it was postponed because of wildfires up there. And then it was going to open a couple weeks ago, and it was postponed, obviously, the fires here. And so I've been, had this work in my studio that I've really wanted to share, but also living with it, especially with Ozzy gone now, has been, painful in a lot of ways. But kind of, for me, it gets to live in a space of like both.
What's up with the eggs? Tell me about the eggs. There's so many eggs.
So many eggs. I use eggs, and and the cigarettes as like kind of a comedic food relief, and the cigarettes are like a kind of comedic everything that's bad in society relief. Like where things are just kind of, even with the fried eggs now, with the bird flu, it's just like everything ends up being something that is not great sometimes. But I always use cigarettes and fried eggs as like, the cigs are the like society joke, and the fried eggs are like the food joke to me. They're fried eggs are so silly and funny. So
well, like classically in art, it's like this space of like birth and like rebirth and a vessel. But I mean, it reminds me of this thing that Ry Rockland did, this group. It's called Food Group. This body of work, and for some reason he asked me to be the pack of cigarettes, so I was the vice group, but I was the only member. But I kind of think that it makes sense. I guess I was the vice chairman.
I was in that show with him, that triangle. Yeah. We did it together.
And so I feel like there's this, like the one doesn't exist without the other, right?
Yeah. And I agree. Like, I like my vices, and, and I like my nature. That's what I mean. Like, they don't exist without the other, and I like that. I think,
And then tell me about this piece, because I feel like this is sort of a departure in a way too. I feel like this is like maybe a different new chapter for you, or like moving in a, like maybe what might be a next direction?
Yeah.
Because you've talked about this idea of doing like, you're working, there's this commission that Emily's working on that has to do it. It's like a pool, right? Or it's like a fountain for a pool.
A fountain for a pool, yeah.
And then, I don't know, we've talked about the idea of like, what would it be like to do a pool? And like,
I'd love
obviously a lot of artists have done really amazing pools. Anyone want a pool done?
Yeah.
I feel like there's this movement in your work from what, you've done these textile pieces and then these smaller works, and then now we're talking about these more painterly works. And I feel like there's the next chapter is sort of like these environmental works, like works that went from talking about the environment to like being the environment. Do you see that like as something that you're moving towards?
I hadn't thought about it like that, but I think that's cool. For this piece, I really wanted to make a big sculpture or big art wall piece that was modifiable and modular and made up of a bunch of small pieces.
And not 400 pounds.
I think I was terrified I accidentally made that piece 400 pounds, and that wasn't totally my intention. But once we were once I was making it, it was this additive process of building, all the frames in that frame, everything we hand milled and planed in my studio, and every step of the way it got heavier. But also every step of the way Ozzy was dying more. And so I was like, just go forward. And, the weight of it is not surprising to me at this point, and it goes very much with where I, was at while building it. But this, I think at the same time, I was trying to give myself some relief of, I've always liked being able to move things on my own. Even as a kid, rearranging my bedroom, I was like pushing things around with my feet. And I've worked for artists who have very, very, very heavy pieces and require whole crews to come in to move them. And I just really didn't want my work to live in that realm. And so making this piece, I wanted to make a big piece that I could just kind of do by myself, basically. But even with the the painting of the clouds, in that process, I invented for myself, maybe everyone else already does this, but a new way of painting and glazing for me. Just using water and manipulating the way water is moving around kind of gave me these textures of the clouds with glazes mixed in, and that was very exciting for me. But even the glazes are specifically they're called Cosmos glaze. It's like very galactic experiments that work out sometimes and don't work out other times, the nature of glaze. I do think I'd like to, make some work in this direction. I didn't know we would even install it. It was such an experiment. I felt like trying to talk about it. I'd show pieces of it on the floor, and none of us could really wrap our heads around it. And so during install, I was like, let me just try to install it by myself and with my team, my husband, and see if we could work it out. And it worked out, I think.
And I think outside the studio, you sort of have this life that sort of mirrors, you're like kind of the artist that makes the work you make, like you couldn't make any other work. Because I feel like your interests are these like things of like cooking and cooking for other people and like gardening, and you have these sort of interests that align with the work that you make. I mean, is that, I don't know where I'm trying to go with that, but
I wouldn't know how to make other work.
But I mean, I feel like your work very much seamlessly melds with like the life you live outside the studio. Do you feel like that's sort of informing the way that you think about things?
I mean, I think that even, working with clay and working with food is a very similar vocabulary and action, whether you're like rolling out dough, rolling out clay, you're using fire. You know, we all have our little tools that we use. I cook a lot for a lot of people. I do a lot of nonprofits and whatnot, and friends. Yeah, I think they go hand in hand with me. I think it's just, I don't know.
And your mother was a baker.
Yeah.
And a cake decorator.
Yeah.
I'm not going to make her cry.
I was like,
no, but I mean, do you think that also like plays into the way that you work with clay and work with the way that your materials are? I mean, like growing up, do you think that that's sort of like one of these things that led to how you are now? You know, like the way that you handle material. Because I do feel like this piece, you know, like you could see like a cake decorator, like you know what I mean? You could see like the inner workings of that mind, like coming to that. And how would you make, and I think to make something like that in clay, I think is also a different, you know, concern than making it out of food. It's there's a different science, but there's a similar impulse maybe.
There's a similar fear if you're driving with it in your car that it's going to break. Yeah, my mom was a baker and cake decorator, and she was an amazing artist, and I think taught me a lot about cooking for people and about making art and just kind of being free to experiment. When I was my first year in grad school, I did a show that was called Mother Me, and there were these cakes made out of wax that burned down. I'm gonna try really hard not to cry. But when I was growing up, I grew up in bakeries and cake shops, and our mom would always write our names on our hand with frosting. We'd lick it off, and that was like the greatest thing as a kid. But when I was in school, I did those cakes, and then I wrote everyone's name on their hands in frosting. And it was a really personal, it felt like too personal, and it felt like after that, slipped deeper into grad school and was like, we're going to talk about things that are not super personal ever again. And I got really involved in, you know, the very logistical and political aspects of like the seed vaults, like I was mentioning. But with that, that is also still very personal, and for all of us, you know, like food is very personal. And so with all of that said, back to the very personal here, but I think
just like even the way that you're handling the material, it's very, you know, it's exacting in this way that it's like, you know, like it's in the way that clay is the same as cake. It's like this idea it's ready for collapse or something. You know, it's right on that edge.
Yeah. Yeah, and it does collapse. Yeah, the pieces do collapse. Yeah, I see that. I see a lot of similarities in the way that I handle the materials and the way that my mom would and taught me to do that. Yeah. Yeah.
Do we have, I don't know, do we have cash questions?
Yeah.
I have a question.
You have a question.
For him.
I'll take all the questions.
I was wondering if you wouldn't mind speaking a little bit about, as an artist, like channeling emotion in your work and how you know when to channel it or when to feel it. And yeah, I mean, I think you have a very special relationship to how your emotions come into work. And I'm still trying to figure it out, even though we've had many visits, many conversations about it. And I think it's part of what is resonating with people is that emotions are really, you know, sitting up at the surface in some of the work through the way that you're using material. And then sometimes it's in the content, more of like the image. But yeah, maybe you can talk a little bit about that. And the kind of addendum question to it is, I think grief is like at the top of people's minds right now. I think it kind of has been for a minute. And I think that I'm very impressed with the way that you think about grief in your work and in your life. And maybe you can talk a little bit about that. I mean, for me, that is like one of the most powerful things in your work. I know it might be difficult to talk about, but it is like really what made me cry the first time I stepped into your studio and saw your work. It was really powerful, and I think people need some guidance around that and need to know that others are dealing with it in different ways.
Well, I'm going to face away for this part of the. I think that I have been experiencing grief. I've lost a lot for a long time. And I feel like Ozzy is just kind of like that end part, not end, but was kind of the culmination of many years of, that feeling of fearing of loss. And I feel like I can't really say emotionally, like it's hard to, verbalize that, I guess, other than feeling like a very unapologetic feeling of feelings, and I feel like this show is about a lot of things that I love a lot. And I feel like I didn't have to conceptualize that too hard. I just was kind of making work that came together. Even the smaller pieces on the wall, I feel like are like a little bit more minimal than everything else. And I feel like they're quieter in a way than the other pieces. And I feel like the quietness came like as he was, really dying. And I didn't have to keep making work. It just was the way I was making work at the time. I didn't feel like organizing this show that there was totally a list that needed to get done. Things could fall off if they were just not, becoming what I wanted them to become. But I think I was feeling so much at the time and allowing that openness in my studio that everything just kind of let me keep working. And with the materials, like a lot of these pieces are, my hands kind of beating in the clay, and not even in like beating isn't really the right word, but just like kind of like touching and pressing and using that texture to like create an image of like ripples of water. It all became very reflective in the nature of thinking about water, but also I think like very, self-reflective at the same time. And I feel like, I guess I'll have to sit on that a little bit more. It's hard to, I don't know. Yeah.
Well, maybe there's this idea of, maybe it's like this inversion of, a lot of artists think with this idea of concept or construct first. And, you have to get this conceptual framework around your work, and then you go meet that. And I think that what's happening here is you're doing it the other way. You're going through this emotional process, letting that end up where it does, and then these like formal and conceptual concerns sort of thread themselves together through that process, which I think is like, that's a harder way to go probably, but in a certain sense, there's like more honesty to it, you know? And I think that's what you're talking about, like something resonating. Things resonate because they're like real, and some work that's so tied up in theoretical concerns, it has there's the process of losing the humanity. And like any of this stuff is just about humanity at the end of the day, right?
No,
you go.
Thank you. Respect.
Thanks.
I really love this show. I love the way you're talking about it.
Thank you.
I just wanted to offer that, you know how the viewer, artist needs to do one thing, the viewer brings something else to it. And I didn't want to read about the work before I saw it. I like to kind of just experience it first. And I walked in and I was kind of going, what is this? You know? And then I turned around and I saw this wall, which reminded me of The Little Prince, which is like a children's book, or it's like a book of philosophy disguised as a children's book. And I felt as if in that context, for me, it was like, oh, okay, this appears sentimental because it involved pets, you know, and every artist I know, famous or not, makes drawings of their pets, you know, and it's real and it's heartfelt, and they don't necessarily put them out in the world because it could be construed as sentimental bad, you know. So I think this feels very brave, and it gives a kind of permission to the viewer to. I mean, I think the subject of art of all time is immortality, and it's sort of saying, where do we all experience that, you know, that you can hardly even talk about because it's a family pet. You know, I don't know, it's just beautiful.
Thank you.
I love it.
That's a lot for me. You gave me a lot to think about, and well, two things. One, I when I make work or I see work, I love to not. I think this goes back to like the seed bank stuff where it was like very didactic, and like I love to where work can just be, you know, I'm tangling my words right now, but like it's like when you write a book and you put it out into the world and people read it, and it's like you might be reading my words, but you picture the characters differently, and it becomes a whole world of your own. And like I think that's so important for art viewing too, where you have to kind of let something go and be interpreted. It could look like your dog or remind you of something, you know, from your life. And I think that's probably one of the most important things about looking at art, in my opinion, is the way that it can live in the world with other people and not just, this is my dog, you know, deal with it, you know. But the second thing, I think, I feel like I've said too many times today, this like an unapologeticness and feeling like it is sentimental and it is sad and it is very personal. And I feel like that's okay. So, yeah.
Well, but also there's this idea of like Trojan horsing, you know, where you can carry this like frontality of sentiment, and then behind it, it's very deep conceptually. I think that's what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
It's like, you know, it's getting you into the space of the work. And then like once you're in there, it's a deep well, you know.
Thanks.
And, you know, but I also think that like what you're talking about, there's this like kind of Seth Price concept of like the circulation of the work is the work. You know, that like the reading of like your dog into this dog, and this dog was, you know, like the movement of how it circulates throughout like this room or this show or wherever it goes next. I think that is also that becomes the work too. Mm-hmm. The writing about it.
I was actually thinking something quite along the lines of this. A couple of years ago, I was in Emily's studio. It wasn't fired, she was still with something. And to me, what I saw right away was like, it was like almost encapsulating like her personality. She loves her dog. And all the items around her are like, you know, things of her personality as well. But now, with seeing it within this whole show, it's where they're just sitting here looking and he's got a little tear. And it's almost like he's wearing like a coat of like badges, things that like their shared experience. And so now it becomes something completely different to me, seeing the same piece within this show. So just wondering, like, as you create things, do you change what they mean to you, or do they just morph and become what they want to be?
Thanks, Aaron. Kind of both. You know, I hold on to certain things as symbols for sure. You know, like the red poppies are used as, you know, from World War II as a flower of remembrance, and I use them for that, and not just from, you know, previous war, but just as like a symbol of that. And when I see one out in the world, it always gives me pause. But also, I'm happy to let those morph too, or get a new meaning, you know, the way they cross my path. I'm happy to kind of not be super concrete with that. Yeah. I like the badge of honor.
But there's also this idea of, like, you know, they have these references in the world, like the spider webs, water, you know, is a reflection and a surface and a depth. And there's, you know, there's different, you know, you're saying the poppies and the daisies, and, you know, there's these sardines, like they have these coded meanings sort of like within history and art history, but then there's sort of like your taxonomy of them and how they arrange themselves in your work.
Yeah, and I like having my own vocabulary there, but also like art history references for me in the work is really important, because I think I love a lot of art, and I feel okay when those kind of make their way into my work in a way that's like a little nod. Yeah.
Your outfit is incredible today.
Oh, thank you.
I'm curious if you knew you were going to be sitting there and picked the shoes, the socks, the jacket, and the ring on your right ring finger specifically to match pieces, or if you just put it on today.
When I was putting it together, I was actually a little bit mortified of how much I matched. Yeah, thank you.
I have a quick thing. I just wanted to thank you. It's a beautiful show.
Thank you.
Really touches me in a personal way. That's moonlight, like that. And I want to thank you because the work is very technological.
Thank you very much.
Anybody else? I think we're
Thank
good.
you, everyone.